Hello, these are Flip Notes 5.4 and the second in our series on disorders. In this section, I'm going to talk about anxiety disorders, including OCD, generalized anxiety disorder, and PTSD. Let's get started. So anxiety and disorders in general are characterized by excessive fear to something real or imagined. The symptoms usually can include intense worry, but also physical and psychological manifestations. And we'll talk about what that means with each one. A specific phobia. So phobias in general are a fear of something, but with a specific phobia, there's a very specific object or fear. Probably one of the most common ones is acrophobia, which is a fear of heights, arachnophobia, a fear of spiders. But for a specific phobia in general, whatever it is, and there are hundreds, if not thousands of specific phobias, it's an immediate and overwhelming fear. Even just the thought of being around it can send a person into a panic attack. Usually it includes avoidance behavior that because they're scared of it so much that it impacts their normal functioning by having to try to figure out how they're going to avoid those things. Physical symptoms, sweating, trembling, dizziness, the rapid heartbeat, basically things that would come along with a panic attack. But again, a lot of us have normal fears, but for it to be a phobia, it's got to be that distressing, dysfunctional, deviant, so more than what the average person would be scared of. Agoraphobia is usually considered an entire category. Agoraphobia literally means fear to go to market, but it's an intense fear of social situations, including public transportation, having to give speeches in front of people, standing in line, being in a crowd, or even just being anywhere outside of their home alone. Phobias are often linked to panic disorder, but panic disorder is its own disorder, and that involves frequent panic attacks. So a lot of people will experience panic attacks, but when they're happening consistently, then it's a panic disorder. So a lot of times people will call 911 thinking they're having a heart attack, that they feel pain in their chest, they feel like they're going to pass out, they just feel like an overwhelming sense of dread and like they're dying. And in fact, it could just be a panic disorder, which can be equally as scary as a heart attack. But it's this overwhelming rush of chemicals in the brain and hormones throughout the body. And until a person kind of rides through it, it doesn't go away. But there's the biological, cognitive, and emotional component to it. And then a lot of times, once a person has had one, then that triggers the anxiety that it's going to happen again. There are some other examples in other cultures outside of our own of disorders that they call something else, but it is very similar to panic disorders. In the Caribbean and the Iberian Peninsula, which is like Spain, they have ataque de nervios, which is the attack of the nerves. So it's this very similar to a panic attack, but people will have this uncontrollable screaming. Sometimes they become very aggressive or suicidal. And a lot of times they almost are like out of touch and dissociated, depersonalized. But it's a different cultural form of panic disorder. Social anxiety disorder kind of goes along with phobia and agoraphobia, but it's an intense fear of being judged or watched by others. Another cultural one that is related to this in the Japanese culture is taijin kyofushu, or a fear that others are judging you so much that you feel like you are offending them. You're so scared of offending others and that just your presence is undesirable and unpleasing. So you're just you're so scared of people looking at you that you think your presence is disgusting to them. Generalized anxiety disorder is anxiety, but there's no specific cause, and it's prolonged. It's just kind of anxious all the time. Lots of things. There may be specific triggers, but it's this constant excessive anxiety and worry. It's difficult to control, often related to chemical imbalance in the brain, and that's why you can't just talk yourself out of it. Usually linked to at least 3 or more of the following, but this restless, kind of keyed up or just on the edge, anxious feeling. Often people who have generalized anxiety disorder are really tired and fatigued, and it's because they're thinking all the time about all the things that they're anxious about. Sometimes it can be hard to concentrate, or even just their mind goes blank after a while. Easily irritable, again, because they're trying to think about so many things. They hold their tension in their muscles, and it affects their sleep. Again, a lot of us feel anxious, but it becomes a disorder when it's to the point where it is ultimately interrupting their normal daily functioning. So what causes these different anxiety disorders? A lot of it is learned associations, especially with the specific phobias. Cognitive, the maladaptive thinking and emotional responses, that you get stuck into a routine of thinking that's not healthy. And then a big explanation, and we know it's a strong explanation because medication is so successful in helping people with these, is the genetic factors. So different things like GABA being affected, norepinephrine, we'll go into some more detail in class, but also just a neurotic personality style, which means you're more prone to worry. Our next category, obsessive compulsive disorders. OCD actually used to just be considered an anxiety disorder, but in the more recent versions of the DSM, it's been moved into its an entire own category because it's so prevalent and there's so many little subtypes of OCD. So OCD is characterized by the presence of two behaviors, the obsessions, which are the intrusive thoughts that they cannot control, and compulsions, which are repetitive, intrusive behaviors that are meant to soothe the obsessions. It is possible to have just one or the other, which would be an obsessive disorder or a compulsive disorder, but specifically here we're talking about OCD, which combines them both. So they do have the recurrent intrusive thoughts, and that prompts the compulsions, which are supposed to help to neutralize the thoughts. A lot of people who have OCD will describe that they know that it doesn't make sense, and that they know that what they're doing is not correct, and it's not normal, and it's maladaptive, but they cannot control it. So it's dysfunctional, and they can't control it even though they wish that they could. Hoarding disorder is a specific disorder that falls in the OC, the obsessive compulsive categories. This compulsion, they're just collecting so many things that are generally useless or trivial, like old newspapers, even garbage, magazines, and they just have a really difficult time getting rid of stuff. Like even if somebody's offering to help them, it is very, very hard to discard objects, even trash, and it causes extreme anxiety. Causes for the obsessive compulsive disorders, again, a lot of learned associations that at some point they learned that this is good, this makes me feel good to be able to hold on to these things, but then it goes to an extreme. The maladaptive thinking, like worrying about germs and all the bad things that can happen. And again, a strong biological genetic link, and we're able to determine that that is connected to the success of medications that are able to treat those. Our next category are the dissociative disorders. This includes dissociative identity disorder and dissociative amnesia. Dissociative identity disorder is what used to be called multiple personality disorder. With that, they have a presence of two or more distinct personality states. This one is really hard to diagnose because it's a lot hard to find empirical evidence. It's hard to get somebody to call out the personalities on their own. The majority of psychiatrists do not acknowledge this as a valid disorder, but there are some who do. I think it's about a third or maybe it's a quarter who do acknowledge it as a disorder. And even if the person doesn't truly have distinct separate identities, they do have something going on, possibly a personality disorder. But with this, the personality states usually are so separate. They're not always, sometimes they're aware of the other personalities, sometimes they're not, but they can have all kinds of distinctive characteristics. Dissociative amnesia is a type of repression where a person cannot remember their personal information. So sometimes this happens after trauma, but they just don't know who they are, and there's no biological explanation for it. A dissociative fugue is when a person has this amnesia and they wander off and sometimes start a whole new life or create a new identity. But the fugue is like a traveling dissociative amnesia. Causes, almost all people who are experiencing dissociative disorders it's linked to trauma and extreme stress. And then our next category are the trauma and stress related disorders. PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, used to be considered, they just called it shell shock, and it was something that only soldiers experienced. But now we know that anybody can experience PTSD. It can be from surviving a natural disaster like a tornado, a car wreck, or even personal abuse. But some symptoms of that, they're become hypervigilant. Flashbacks are the biggest one. Flashbacks to the point that when they think about it, their body goes into fight or flight mode. It's so severe and it's so vivid. So severe anxiety of worrying about when those flashbacks are going to happen, insomnia because of the vivid dreaming that goes with it, which all of that can lead to emotional detachment and hostility. But people who have PTSD, it's like their body can't get out of fight or flight mode. So there's this like increase in norepinephrine. So they're always on edge. Causes of that, again, trauma, and then the stress triggers. Something happens in the brain. A lot of study and research is still going on with this one. The chemical that seems to be most involved here is norepinephrine, which we know is our fight or flight neurotransmitter, that something is causing the continuous release of norepinephrine. All right, that's it for this section.